I hate the airport. I couldn't help but think that as I stood in yet another baggage check line. The sounds of whirring belts and the clattering of shoes on the hard ground filled the space around me. Parents nearby trying to calm their disgruntled children as they fought and screamed with all their might. The elderly in front of me moving like molasses, bringing everything around them to a standstill. The clerks at each of the counters, giving off 1,000-yard stares if they all had just served in a hellish war. Although my disdain for this place was great, it was a necessary evil that I had to face for my job. It's hard to be a traveling consultant if, well, I'm not traveling. Some of you might ask why I don't find some other work, and while that is an option, most starting positions wouldn't give me the salary or benefits I am currently receiving. I walked up to the counter and handed the woman my ticket and ID. She never made eye contact with me the entire time. She just punched the keys on her computer before asking me to set my bags down on the scale. I hoisted them up and set them down. A few moments later, she printed out some tags and placed my bags on the conveyor belt behind her. She handed me my receipt and told me to enjoy my flight. Despite all my misgivings about air travel, I was planning on enjoying this flight, as I had been traveling basically non-stop since the beginning of the year, flying all over the country and performing inspections at the various locations owned by my company. This time, however, I was flying back home to enjoy an entire month off from work. After passing through security, I made my way over to my gate. I was early, so I had to find a seat nearby to wait for my plane to land. I ended up having to sit in between a family whose kids seemed to be shouting at an iPad at irregular intervals, and a man shoveling some form of a sandwich into his face. I shifted and turned my attention to my phone, in an effort to block out everything around me. Time seemed to blur, and I was startled out of my scrolling by a voice announcing that they were going to start boarding soon. I snapped my attention up and looked around. I glanced towards the nearby window and saw that the plane was sitting at the gate as if it had been there the whole time. I rubbed my eyes before standing up and making my way over to the gate. One by one, we all filed into that small hallway that led to the plane itself. As I stood on the cusp of the connector and the plane, I couldn't help but feel a strange shift in the air around me. It only lasted for a fraction of a second, but it was like the air felt 10 times heavier than normal, before immediately dissipating. I filed back towards my seat and sat down. I then began my usual routine of silently praying for decent passengers around me. Though my prayers were rarely answered, after a few moments, the flight attendants shut the doors. I looked around and saw that the plane was actually fairly empty. There were still some passengers about, but the plane wasn't packed. There was only one person to my right, and he seemed like a younger man, in his early 20s. He sat there and scrolled on his phone much like I had been earlier. I thanked the benevolent gods and glanced out of the window, as the attendants began to rattle off flight procedures. After the demonstration, the plane began to taxi onto the runway. A few nerve-wracking seconds passed before my upper body had become compressed into my seat. Before I knew it, the plane was already leveling out in the sky. I stared out of the window as the ground slowly faded beneath the clouds. I checked my watch before shutting the window next to me and closing my eyes. I never used to be able to sleep on planes. Something about having people constantly around me, and the intermittent turbulence. But after a few years of this job, I had quickly learned how to block everything out and drift off. Shortly after I had fallen asleep, I was jolted awake by the plane shaking violently. I leaned forward and groggily opened my eyes. The plane was clearly hitting some heavy turbulence, but this was far more than I had ever experienced before. After a few nauseating seconds, the plane evened out and the shaking stopped. I looked around, and that's when I noticed something was off. The young man that was sitting next to me was no longer looking down at his phone. He was staring at the seat in front of him. Still desperately trying to wake up, I glanced down at my watch. It took me a moment to realize that the hands on my watch hadn't moved since we had taken off. I shook my wrist before bringing my watch to my ear. Battery must have died, I thought. I slid up the screen on the window and looked outside. I felt my heart seize in my chest as my brain tried to make sense out of what I was seeing. The sky was black. There were no clouds, just an empty void. I looked down, and there was nothing. No ground, no water, just darkness. This didn't make sense to me for multiple reasons aside from the obvious. My flight was only supposed to be 2.5 hours. I boarded my plane at 1:30 p.m., so there was no way it should be this dark outside, even if we were flying through a storm. I sat back in my seat and rubbed my eyes once again. I tried to look past the seats in front of me, and every single person was doing the same thing as the guy sitting next to me. They were all staring straight ahead. I wasn't sure what was going on. I pulled out my phone and attempted to turn it on. The screen glowed briefly for a few seconds before going dark again. I was beginning to think that I was still asleep, that this was all just a very vivid dream. Then I heard a noise which drew my attention behind me. It sounded like someone cracking their knuckles. I turned and peeked through the small space in my chair. There was something at the back of the plane. It was standing in the aisle. It was difficult to see because towards the back of the plane was completely dark, as if all the lights in the rear of the cabin had been snuffed out. It was tall and thin, with its head nearly scraping the roof of the cabin. Its long fingers cracked and popped as it placed its hands on the seat next to it. That was the sound that had drew my attention. It would stop, lean down into one of the aisles, then return back to its previously standing position. As it moved down the aisle, the lights would flicker out one by one. Upon leaning into another aisle, as it was returning to its standing position, its eyes seemed to lock with mine through the small crack in my seat. I snapped forward, and I could feel sweat beginning to bead on my forehead. I shut my eyes tightly, hoping to God that I would just wake up, and I'd be safely back on the ground. I opened my eyes once again, and just as I did, the lights above me flickered out. That thing was getting closer. It finally reached my aisle, and it was standing just inches away from the man to my right. I opened my eyes and stared straight ahead, not daring to blink. It bent down and leaned in. Through the corner of my eye, I could see its face clearly. Its head was grotesque. It was like it was rotting. Its skin was gray and marred with scratches and missing flesh. My grip on the armrest tightened as I looked towards the lower half of its face. It was gone. Its entire lower jaw was missing. A slimy black tongue just hung loosely from the back of its neck. It seemed to stare into the man's eyes for a few seconds, before turning its attention to me. Its neck seemed to extend all on its own, and its head floated directly in front of me. I quieted my breathing and stared blankly ahead. My calm demeanor was just a product of the paralyzing fear I was currently under. It looked me in the eyes, and I could see that its eyes were a ghostly shade of white. It had no pupils whatsoever. The seconds passing by felt like an eternity. Then, its neck began to retract, and it continued on down the aisle. I let out a shaky breath, and watched as it repeated this process for each aisle. Then, suddenly, it stopped at an aisle a few feet ahead, and a loud shriek filled the cabin. It reached in and ripped someone out of their seat. It dragged them into the very center of the aisle, before vanishing in a cloud of black smoke. The plane began to shake violently once more, and I shut my eyes praying for it to stop. When it finally did, I opened them again and saw that there was light peeking through the window on my left. I looked to my right and saw the young man was staring at his phone. He turned and saw that I was drenched in sweat and had a panicked look on my face. He then asked me if I was all right. I exhaled heavily and nodded, telling him I just had a bad dream. The plane eventually landed, and as I was disembarking, I stopped next to the seat where the creature had made that terrible noise. The seats were completely empty, but I noticed that on one of them, the seatbelt had been torn in half. I swallowed my nerves and exited the plane. When I was finally back on the ground, I walked over to a wall and just leaned against it for a bit. I pulled my phone out and looked at it. Something instantly caught my attention. It was the date. An entire week had passed since I had gotten on that plane. I had arrived at the airport at 1:30 p.m. on Sunday, and it was now 4:15 p.m. on Saturday. I checked my tickets and they all say 1:30 p.m. Saturday the 7th, but I know that isn't right, because I had completed my consultation on Saturday the 29th of February, and my flight home was the next day. I checked all my travel info and they all said the same thing, that my departure time was Saturday the 7th at 1:30 p.m. I sighed and wondered if I had simply gotten my dates mixed up. But then, I looked down at my wrist. My watch, which had died during the flight, it was still dead. But as I looked at the small face, in the tiny little box that shows the date, it showed a 1. I have so many questions. Like, what was that thing? Where did it come from? Why did it target that random person, and where did it take them to? Why did we all lose a week of our lives, but none of the other passengers seemed to notice? Nothing about that flight makes any sense. Regardless, I think during my time off from work, I'm going to apply for a new position, so I never have to step foot inside an airport. Ever. Again.